kann ich schon mal ankündigen, dass wir uns sehr freuen, dass Rola Naeb aus UK zu uns gekommen ist. Rola und ich kennen uns auch schon ein bisschen länger. Rola ist jetzt aber tatsächlich, was sehr interessante Entwicklung ist und warum wir uns sehr freuen, dass sie hier ist, Teil einer Arbeitsgruppe beim Europarat, die daran arbeitet, den europäischen Referenzrahmen für Sprachen zu erweitern, um eine Niveaustufe unter A1. Deskriptoren zu entwickeln für Zweitsprachenlerner, die noch vor dem eigentlichen Spracherwerb in der Alphabetisierung sind. Das heißt, für nicht alphabetisierte Zweitsprachenlerner Deskriptoren zu entwickeln, um die Kompetenzen dieser Lerner zu erfassen. So sage ich es vielleicht am besten und sie wird es uns gleich viel genauer erläutern. Sie ist Teil der Arbeitsgruppe und sie ist spezifisch dann nochmal zuständig für die digitalen Kompetenzen, die in diesen Deskriptoren erfasst werden. Und das macht sie natürlich zu einer ganz besonderen Rednerin. Und ja, auch wenn jetzt die Reihen sich ein bisschen gelichtet haben, wollen wir sie mit einem warmen Applaus empfangen. Very warm welcome to you, Rola.
Very much, Celia, first for inviting me to do this talk, and thank you all for being here. I know it's been a long day, and I'm already nervous, and the problem is that when I'm nervous, I speak fast, okay? So I'm relying on my friends and on you to let me know so I can slow down, okay? If I start to go really fast, okay? I think I'm more nervous after all the fascinating talks we had so far. What I want to do is start actually with the very quick notes that I've taken from the three plenaries that I've attended so far. And although I'm going to be talking about policy, I'm not a politician, but I more or less take like Michael's view today, Professor Karras, when he said that we should all think we shape the future. Sorry. Yes, okay, it's fine. Okay, so I think we should all definitely think about how we shape the futures. And part of this is to look at what is out there. Does it work? Does it not work? So what I will be doing is bringing the discussion about digital competencies, about digital literacy, along to the European framework of reference. And then I'm going to focus specifically on the case of low literate adult learners, low or no, those with low or no literacy, okay? So I will be touching on questions like, for example, the one by Graciela that Graciela said in her presentation, at what level of literacy can we use digital tools as learners? Okay, but also on, for example, what Tobias said in his presentation about artificial intelligence. How can we evaluate? How can we trust? What kind of skills do we need as part of the digital literacy? Okay, intelligent feedback systems. I'm not going to be talking about this, but definitely they are part of what we could do. It's more or less about what, again, you said, Graciela, and I couldn't think of a better introduction to my talk than all the three talks that we had today. Acquiring functional basic skills in a digital world. Okay, so I'm not alone in the project I'm going to present. So hopefully the technology will work. Okay. It was working. Yeah. Okay. It's working here, but not here.
No. Let's see.
Okay.
So, yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So this is the team that are working on this project. So we've got Lorenzo Rocca from Italy, Fernanda Minez, Alex Feldmeyer Garcia from Germany, Jean Curvers, myself, and Karen from Vienna, and Taina from Finland. Okay. And what I will be talking about today is digital literacy, just to establish a common kind of definition. Then I'll move on to talk about digital competencies frameworks. So I will be touching on some of the frameworks that you've already heard about. Then I'll be talking about the CEFR, which I know that you use a different German abbreviation for here from my discussion with the people around. So this is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And I'll talk about the new framework that we're proposing, which is the EFLL. And I'll present part of the digital competencies descriptors, sample of what we're working on. Okay. So we all agree, I think, we all share the same kind of background in agreeing that in an increasingly digital world, literacy goes beyond the ability to read and write. Okay, now the ability to use information and communication technology and the internet becomes a new form of literacy. So we cannot just survive, whether we are adult migrants, whether we are just not migrants, adult children. We cannot survive in this increasingly digital world without digital literacy. So information and communication technologies are transforming the way that we read, that we write, interact, find, make use of information, and make use of public life in general. Okay. But then what do we mean by literacy or digital literacy? Okay. So I've got two definitions here. One is more from an academic point of view. The other one is from the UNESCO's new publication on the digital framework. So the first one is the ability to find, evaluate, utilize, share, and create content using information technologies and the internet. So it's not just also about using computers or mobile phones. The UNESCO defines this, and this is in their 2018 framework now, the ability to define, access, manage, integrate, communicate, evaluate, create information safely and appropriately through digital technologies and network devices for participation in economic and social life. Okay, but how does this work? Okay, there is no doubt that digital literacy is fast becoming a prerequisite for citizenship, for creativity, for innovation, for all aspects of life. Okay, but it's not just about education. It confirms to all the dimensions of the digitally infused world. Okay, now, in a recent article, the Tech Advocate magazine, they said that digital literacy is actually the most important lifelong learning tool and the most important skill that we need to equip learners with. Okay. But then, what is the difference between literacy and digital literacy? If we go back to all the definitions that I've just mentioned at the start, we can see that the difference between like literacy in its traditional form, which is mainly the ability to read and write. If we move to digital, we find that it's not just about reading and writing. It's about like creating content, defining content, managing, evaluating, and very good examples, okay, is the example by Tobias about like the videos. It's about knowing that these are fake videos. These are not good information. The other good example is what Graciela used in her Spanish friends who send her information that are fake, although these are literate people. So digital literacy encompasses a set of skills that are far beyond the traditional literacy ability. So there is no surprise that many organizations, globally, nationally, try to work on different digital competencies frameworks, okay? So try to identify what encompasses these digital literacy concept, okay? What are the competencies? What are the skills needed? And how do we measure them, okay? Wide range of frameworks we can find. Sometimes they are national, global, depending on the organization, depending on who is working on this framework. So they could focus on literacy, they could focus on citizenship, they could take the perspective of like what is digital literacy in schools or in adult education. Okay, so of course there is no way that we can do all, we can review all the digital literacy frameworks, digital competencies frameworks, but I've taken this one, which is the recent one published by the UNESCO. So the UNESCO published what they called a global framework of reference on digital literacy skills for indicator 442. Okay, and I know that someone here is from the UNESCO, so I hope that they can correct me, yes, if I'm wrong. So the framework identifies 6 main competencies that can be used to measure digital competency, okay? The first one is devices and software operations, which they call 0. Then 1 is information and data literacy, communication and collaboration, digital content creation, safety, problem solving, and career-related competencies. Okay, so these are the competencies that are defined, the domains that are defined as the main major ones under the UNESCO's framework. Okay, and I'm not expecting you to read all of this. Okay, so these are examples of what goes under each of these categories. Okay, but I'll just like look at the first one, which is the 0 kind of competency they had, which is the devices and software operations. So under this one, we've got to identify and use the functions and features of the hardware tools and technologies. And what I want you to do is to think about your own learners, particularly those low literate ones, and to think whether they are able to tick the box for this skill. Can they do that? Okay, so let's move on to the other forms of literacy. So these are like the continuation of the descriptors about what encompasses digital literacy. Yeah. Then we've got some European frameworks, and I know also that some of you here have been involved in the development of these frameworks. So we've got one, which is the European framework for digital literacy. We've got the European digital citizenship framework, and then we've got the digital competence framework 2.0, which is also the newly published one, is in 2018, May 2019. So this is the most recent one. So I'm going to focus on this one, and I'm going to see how we can use it to create descriptors for digital competencies that suit low literate learners. Okay, so this is the digital competency into action publication, which is used as a guide by the European Commission to identify what skills, what competencies are needed in general. Okay, so they define again 6 main competencies. So they've got digital content creation, safety, problem solving, communication and collaboration, information and data literacy. Okay, and under these ones, these are some of the examples they have. Okay, so they range into like different levels as well. But this is the basic level, for example, 1.1 under the information and data literacy, and it's browsing, searching and filtering data, information and digital content. And again, what I would like you to do is to think about like your own learners and think about whether they are able to do this. And we're talking about like those low literate or those with no literacy in the L1 in their first language. So these are more or less the Somali kind of women that Graciela described in her presentation earlier as well. Okay. What we will find reviewing most of the frameworks that exist, not just like the European one, but also national frameworks. And again, I'm only talking about those published in English. So there might be other frameworks that are published in like certain languages, but they are not available for us to review. But those that are available in English, if we look at them, most of them actually ignore the fact that some adult migrants arrive in the host countries with no literacy or with little literacy in the L1. These are placed in courses most of the time below A1, if these courses exist in the host countries, okay? Why these learners are special? Because again, as you all know this, these face the complex task of acquiring literacy at the same time as acquiring a second language. So these are facing the task, the complex, demanding task of learning the language while either learning to read and write for the first time ever or developing their literacy competencies. And I'm sure you agree with me that there are much more demands on these learners, which can affect their progress. Okay? So if we take now the discussion to the Common European Framework of Reference, which I know now that you all know, so I'm going to skip some of these slides. Okay? So it's used for syllabi kind of design, examination, testing, all over Europe. It's description of 6 levels of proficiency from A1 to C2. But then again, I'm not expecting you to read this, but if we look at these descriptors, even at the A1 level, okay? So this is the basic kind of user or language level. So if we look at one of the descriptors, they can interact in a simple way, provided the other person talks slowly and clearly and is prepared to help. But again, how many of our learners who are low literate are able to do this, to interact? Even if the speaker is willing to help, and we're talking here about interacting in the second language, not other types of interaction, which I'm going to touch upon later on, okay? So some of the problems that we find with the SAFR or the European framework is that they treat the learner as a literate social agent. but they also aim to describe language competencies rather than literacy profiles, which is needed for those learners who are low literate or with no literacy. They are also not normative, but descriptive, so they must be adapted for migration context. Okay. In combination with research that has been conducted over the last 10, 20 years on these learners, the research findings, the research outcomes highlight the need for SEFR descriptors that are below A1. The Common European Framework of Reference now has a level which is called pre-A1, but if you look at it, most of the time there are no descriptors under this level. So there are certain descriptors under only one or two tables, but not all of them. So the kind of like the demands or the outcomes of the research, but also looking at the implementation of the SEFR in these contexts with low literate learners, we know that it doesn't work. Okay, this has also been picked up by policymakers. So the recommendation of the Parliamentary Assembly on integration tests, helping or hindering integration. So what they said or what they stated is that the presence of these socially vulnerable subjects is typical of the migration context. Subjects such as illiterate, who cannot read and write in their own mother tongue, or semi-literate people who have very poor resources to study languages in formal context. A language course addressed to them must be supported by a literacy course that makes them able to tackle written texts. It must be appropriate in duration as well as in teaching methods to prevent the risk of marginalization from the education process. Okay, how many courses are or fit these criteria? Okay. So all of these, like the results of the research, the demand of the educational institution, the political and social worries about discrimination and exclusion, all of this, along with the presence now of some national frameworks that are below A1. So we've got now syllabi and frameworks for Dutch, French, German, Italian, Finnish, English, which is Canada actually, that are below A1. All of this led a group of researchers to propose, okay, a framework below A1. Okay. This proposal was taken by the European Commission, by the Council of Europe, and there was a call for experts in 2008, like around February, March, and then 7 people were appointed, so including me, Alexis, and others. Okay. So what we proposed is to create a framework that is a complement to the SEFR, to the Common European Framework of Reference, but that is focused mainly on literacy, acquisition, and learning below A1. Okay. So the EFLL, as it is called at the minute, is a tool to plan courses, design curricula, create teaching materials, and prepare diagnostic and achievement tests at levels below A1. It is aimed at adult migrants with a focus on the LESLA learners, so those with literacy problems, explicitly related to the SEFR, especially to the notion of communicative language competence as a multidimensional competence. Okay. By the way, please ask questions at any point, okay? If anything is not clear. Yes. Now, this is the kind of SEFR proposal that we've got, EFLL proposal that we've got, okay? So what we're proposing is 4 levels at the minute, where Alpha 1 is the very starting point, and we end up with Alpha 4, which is more or less equivalent to A1, okay? And Alpha 3, which is more or less equivalent to A3, pre-A1, pre-A1, okay? So 4 levels for both the technical and the functional literacy, and for oral L2 acquisition. It overlaps with the SEFR, pre-A1 and A1, but it addresses the different learning needs, okay? Literacy learning is parallel to language learning beyond A1, and levels are not single standards, so they are not fixed kind of levels. They are more indicators of profiles, indicators of competencies. Okay, so profiles of competency. And most of these learner profiles are based on educational needs. Okay, so we're not expecting that all learners are going to fit all the criteria at a certain level. Okay. So for this for the tables, the progression is defined in terms of like communicative language activities in relation to the reception, production, interaction, and mediation, technical literacy, and strategies, digital competence, and so overall, we've got 17 overall scales with 24 thematic scales as well, applicable to 4 different domains, which are like the private, public, occupational, and educational domains. Okay, scary. Okay, so these are the tables that we have to come up with. Okay, so under each of these kind of headings, so we've got a full table of descriptors. Okay, so you can imagine it's not that, and I'm not expecting you again to read this, but to give you an example. Okay, so overall scales, these will include scales on the reception, production, and interaction, but under production also we're specifying spoken and written, and under each of these we've got 4 different thematic scales. So we've got the personal domain, public domain, occupational, and educational domain. Okay, but under also the overall scales, on the other hand, we've got communicative language abilities, we've got technical literacy, we've got digital competencies, which is what I'm gonna present today, part of, and we've got like functions, genres, and general notions. Okay. In order to be able to be systematic in the descriptors across all of these tables and scales, what we needed is indicators of progression. How do we indicate progression across the 4 different levels, alpha levels? Okay. So where all of this, all the work I'm presenting today is still in its like kind of initial stage. Okay. So far, we've said that we've got like the following indicators of progression. So we're going to start with working with others before working alone on things. So this is more about getting support from others before you are more autonomous. Okay. Working with guidance before working autonomously. Contextual before abstract notions. Personal relevance before generic. Oral before written, which I think we all agree on. Reception before production. Interaction before reception and production. Practice before new. Meaning before form. And pragmatics before action. Okay, but only for the functional tables or the functional literacy, not for the technical one. Okay, so these are the kind of general indicators of progression across all the scales, all the descriptors. So this is, for example, one example of the tables at alpha 1. And as you will see here, most of these descriptors are way below A1, or what is expected of learners at the A1 level. So in terms of like the language awareness, they know that written language carries meaning, which is exactly what you referred to, Graciela, as well in your workshop just today. First, we need to let them know that actually written context carries meaning in itself, especially if we're talking about those who have never been to school, who have no literacy at all. So can recognize some graphemes in personally relevant words. In terms of the technical writing, can use different writing tools, pen, pencil, keyboard, smartphone, and so on. So these are basic kind of like skills that we think they will be able to carry. So in terms of the technical literacy in particular, we've got like 2 lines of progression in addition to the other ones that I've mentioned. So we've got linguistic and or orthographic complexity. So simple before complex, but also frequency. So focus is on high frequency before low frequency. So for example, at the alpha 2, one of the descriptors is that they can read practice with a simple syllabic structure, which is vowel or consonant vowel bisyllables. At the higher level, so at alpha 3, they will be able to read and understand short and syntactically simple sentences if the words have a simple syllabic structure. So this is how we define the line of progression in the technical literacy. But if we move now and focus on the digital competencies, if we go back to the CEFR, to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, they don't actually have digital competencies descriptors. It is included very briefly in some descriptors, but they don't have it one. And this is surprising, considering all we've been saying today and all other people have been saying about the importance of digital literacy. Taking also into account that the findings from the European Parliamentary Research Service in 2015 said that 90% of jobs in the EU will require some skills by 2020. So if we really want these adult migrants to integrate and find jobs, then we need to equip them with the skills they need to do these jobs. Okay? So individuals who struggle with print reading and writing present a double challenge for us in terms of the digital literacy. Okay? So what we did is we started with a kind of like initial framework of reference for the digital competencies. So we take what the DIGCOM framework of reference, the European framework of reference, identified as the main competencies. So these are the 6 kind of competencies, sorry, the 5 competencies they took from the UNESCO one, and we added one to it, which is what we call technical digital skills. Okay? Because in our view, some learners lack these technical digital skills. So they start sometime here, some start here already. Okay, but we need this level as a starting point as well. And it doesn't mean that learners will all have to complete this before they move here. Because again, if I just to remind you, these are kind of descriptors as profiles rather than actual levels, fixed levels of competencies. Okay, so this is an example of what we're using as descriptors at the initial alpha level. So for example, under digital content creation, we don't think that learners at this stage are able to create content as described in the other digital competencies framework. They can do is copy basic content in print format to a digital format. So if I give, for example, the learner a letter or a paper with their name on it and ask them just to find the letters on the keyboard and put it, they will be able to do this. Okay? So they can share information with others using L1 or visual information. So this is about communication and collaboration, but again, with a focus on the digital world. So maybe for word photos, do recordings. Okay. Many of the people I work with sometimes who are low literate, when they want to communicate with me, they record voice messages on WhatsApp rather than try to write or find, even when they are using their smartphones. Okay. Technical digital skills. They need to know how to log in, maybe with guidance at the start. So for example, a teacher dictating the letters or copying the letters, the learners copying the letters from a written down note. So these are the skills that are actually way below the basic levels that are identified in the other digital competencies framework. So that's partly why we thought that maybe the other competency frameworks don't work for these learners. We need to start at a different level or with different descriptors, okay? But, and here I'm gonna throw a lot of questions at you now, and I'm not gonna give you the answers because I don't have answers still, okay? So I appreciate any kind of feedback or comments from you on any of these questions, okay? So some of the questions that we need to answer before we come up with a full working draft of the descriptors is, for example, shall we focus on only the L1, what learners can do in the L1 or in the L2 or both? Because we all know that adult migrants, even without literacy, they can use smartphones, okay? So in terms of the digital skills, they don't start from scratch, which is not the case for the literacy skills. So shall we focus on, for example, they are able to use Facebook, but they are only able to use it in L1. So shall our descriptors focus only on the L1? Or on the L2, or combination of what they can do regardless of the language they're doing it in. Okay, development is quicker than in print-related literacy. So although we would expect them, for example, to read and write, particularly, for example, in terms of the writing, in print literacy, it would take them much more. But if they're using their smartphone, they can easily find the letters and write. How do we deal with this? Okay, other questions. Which comes first? Which is, I think, a question that was asked today as well in one of the presentations. Is it literacy or digital literacy? What comes first, okay? So for example, they can do certain things, digital tasks that require literacy even without having print-related literacy, which is like using translators or using, for example, speech recognition software. So although some of these apps or skills, they require literacy, but they are able to navigate their way around it without literacy. Are we focusing only on digital literacy skills or digital skills, and how can we separate the two? And by this I mean, for example, knowing that or recognizing that your device needs charging. You can recognize this from the icon without looking at the percentage. So shall we say, for example, they are able to update apps? Okay, they are able to recognize that the mobile needs charging even without being able to read the numbers. Okay. Again, also at the beginning, although we have this 6 kind of competency areas, what we're expecting is that at the beginning there will be a lot of technical descriptors, but then later on the focus is going to be more on content creation and problem solving. Is that a problem? We don't think so, but we'd like to know what you think as well. Do we need to specify which competency each descriptor belongs to, or can we just describe them as general, overall, global kind of descriptors or skills, regardless of whether they are related to data information or safety or other issues? Okay. Shall we include descriptors from other tables? How does it work in terms of the overlap between the other literacy tables? So for example, at Alpha 1, part of under the language and print awareness, we've got this descriptor, which knows that symbols like logos, pictograms, emojis carry meaning in a digital environment. Do we repeat this again in the digital literacy competency descriptor? Or since we've mentioned this already under the language kind of literacy descriptors, we don't need to repeat it. We thought that it's important to separate the competencies into 2 different areas, or different kind of hardware based on hardware. So what they can do on mobile phones or smartphones, and what they do on non-mobile devices. So this is more like dealing with the computer. Although many of them are able to use the smartphones and different apps in the smartphones, they struggle with traditional kind of like desktops and PCs. How do we deal with this? Because they can create content maybe on their mobile phone, but they cannot create it on a PC. Okay. So I know these are a lot of questions, which I will ask for your feedback on a little bit later. But 1 or 2 things that we face in general while we're creating this framework is kind of like ethical issues in terms of like these literacy descriptors are not standard. We don't want them to be used as standards. We don't want them to be used as test referential per se. These are more like social representations of literacy embedded in the word we use these days, okay? We need to consider research. We need to consider the teacher experience, the educational traditions. But in general, what we need also is your involvement as stakeholders. And this includes like teachers, institution managers, all learners themselves in creating this and piloting the European framework that we're coming up with. So lots of questions for you, but to give you a positive kind of like scale of what we're expecting or how we're expecting this to develop. So more or less, we're at this stage now where we're working on the development of the overall and the thematic scales, okay? Later on, in 2019, what we're hoping is to define these scales to be piloted, and then preparing the instruments for validation. So this is going to include translation, surveys, questionnaires, and so on, piloting, and this will be in actual institutions. Okay, so we will ask institutions to use these descriptors to create curricula, to design curricula, to create tests, and so on. Then we will take this feedback, finalize the frameworks and the descriptor, and we're aiming to publish and disseminate the framework by between November 2020 and February 2021. So this is more or less, considering that this effort took 10 years to be finalized. I think we're 2 levels less, so we're hoping to do it much quicker. I think that's more or less everything I have to say, and thank you very much.
I think we take a few questions, do we? Yes. Bevor Sie Ihre Volkshochschule als Pilotstandort melden, gibt es Fragen? Ja, herzlichen Dank erstmal für den interessanten Beitrag. Welche Fragen sind da? Welche Kommentare, Verständnisfragen auch? Antworten auf Rola Naebs Fragen?
I hope that this means everything was clear.
Hi, I'm Victoria Gantino from the Coordination Board for Literacy.
Okay.
A Decade for Literacy, not for literacy, no. I think I was wondering if this very specific section of like skills in the digital context isn't a bit problematic, because maybe in 10 years the skills will not be level alpha 1 anymore, or like a mobile device will maybe still there but not a PC. How do you deal with this, or do you have this in mind with your descriptions?
Thank you. This is a very good question, and considering the rapid kind of like scale that technology advances at, I agree with you 100%, but I think the need at the minute to have this kind of like just indicators of progression, this kind of descriptors to help course designers, to help curriculum developers, what should they pay attention to for? What should they pay attention to at this stage? So yes, maybe at what would happen is later on, some of the descriptors at the very low level, we would hope that all people will be able to pass these stages. But we do know that actually literacy is a problem, not just in the European, with the migrants, but in other countries. So these are more or less descriptors that could be used across the world for digital competency kind of literacy, regardless of whether it is in L1 or L2. So again, this might be a question that we need to consider definitely when we're working on the descriptors, which also leads us to the question, shall we just focus on what they can do in the L2 or generally? And I think, like I was discussing this with Alexis yesterday, and what he suggested is that, for example, we have to think more or less, what do these individuals need to function in the society, okay? So they need to use, for example, ATM, okay? Even in 10 years, not many people will be still, will have been exposed to ATMs. So they will still be valid. But I can see that you've got another point, so go ahead here.
But I mean, maybe in the European Union, there won't be an ATM. Maybe somewhere else there will. So if you put this concrete examples, I think there will be a problem, and like actually on which, let's say, level of digital development a country or a region will be.
Yeah.
Because then you won't be able to use this levels or this leveling for worldwide.
Do you, or are you saying more or less that maybe in 5 years, all the learners who will come over to the Western countries will be literate digitally and yeah. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yes, yeah, definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Oliver from UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning. I just want to make a quick correction.
Yes.
UNESCO's proposed, this is still proposed, we haven't actually agreed upon that.
Yeah.
This was proposed in October in Hamburg, last month actually. The proposed global framework for the indicator, which is global indicator to measure the progress made towards 4.4.2 is based on actually DIGCOM.
Yes.
So it is the previous version of the digital competence of framework of Europe, have been extended further to the below level by mapping different countries' digital competency frameworks against the DIGCOM, and then propose the lower end.
Yes.
Now, I do agree with you, actually. I was actually thinking as well, because when we talk about these frameworks for the countries to move, we are currently working on the global indicator 4.6.1, which is actually literacy, literacy and numeracy for adults and youth. Okay. And that's where we actually came to almost like a debate and continuous discussion. Because when you propose a threshold,
Yeah.
A threshold doesn't mean that it applies to all the countries in the same way.
Yes.
And I think there is a continuous discussion to be followed up about, as you said, depending on the digital development context.
Yes.
And then skills appropriate or functional to that very digital society or societal structure or culture.
Yeah.
I think that should be, paid attention to.
Yes.
But other than that, I would like to also, you to get in touch with the task force on 4.4. They're working actually to develop further these skills and then identify the thresholds for reporting. And they're exactly in the same boat as you are in terms of proposing the lower end for countries in the world which do not necessarily have digital development of the kind, which is, let's say, some parts of the world. Yeah. So I think it is a very good idea what you are doing already, mapping against what and linking it to literacy. And I'm learning quite a bit from my global indicator development. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I agree totally with this, but that's why not just for the digital competencies, for the whole scale, for the whole framework that we're creating, one of the main things we're focusing on, and we're reiterating this all the time, is that these levels, these are not like kind of like things that we're expecting every learner who's at Alpha 1 to be able to do or to fit all the criteria. These are more literacy profiles. So a learner might actually be able to do some of the descriptors from one level, some of the descriptors from another. We all agree that individuality among these learners in terms of the progression, the performance, everything is very, very wide. So that's why these are used as profiles rather than actual competencies, fixed competencies and descriptive competencies. So I totally take both your points on board. Yeah.
Any more questions? Gibt's noch Fragen? It's me from the Volkshochschule Frankfurt. I wanted to go in a near direction. So I think most is clear now, or spoken now. But I was haggling with I'm thinking about the proportional or the possibility of proportionality of these alpha levels and these digital levels completely. So I know it comes often together, and the using is of digital medias is often given by the literacy of the people, but it's so different in the using, especially of the age.
Yes.
So I don't think, and that's together with this development discussion. So I think I don't know if it's possible to match, even if it's only in if it's not so strict, but to match these competences.
To age.
Yeah,
or to match literacy competencies to digital literacy competencies.
To make a proportionality that is given for all ages and all people without that international thing.
Yes,
or discussion. So
I'm not sure if I understood your question. Sorry, I'm going to go back. Yes, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but if I did, what you're asking is whether we are able to match the literacy competencies to the digital literacy competencies regardless of the age, regardless of the other factors.
Circumstances.
Yes.
Circumstances.
What we try to do is come up with descriptors that are not language specific. So what we're trying to come up with is more kind of like overall descriptors that are applicable to all languages in all situations. Again, I think part of our work is to make sure that we're not giving the message that these descriptors are fixed. These are profiles indicate that the teacher, the curriculum designer can use to know, for example, where to put milestones, how to measure.
I
wouldn't agree that this matches in that proportional way, because I have old learners that are never using digital media, or okay, they have a mobile phone, but they aren't using it to communicate, and they don't have people around them to use it because they are lonely and they.
But
So
do they use these digital tools with their friends back home, with their family back home?
Often not. So, but they are reading in A-level 4. So I don't think it can be seen proportional.
Yes. No, I can see your point, and I think this is much more related to the question that we had before about like how do we match what comes first, literacy or digital literacy, and how can we make sure that we're consistent, because we're assuming that certain things they will be able to do in the digital world, but they won't be able to do in like a print or traditional kind of environment. So this is a question that we've got actually out that we want to find an answer to, or like get more information about whether we should go one way or the other. So any feedback is definitely useful. I know Alex has wanted to comment on this. Yes.
I will chat in German.
Yes.
Also ich denke, was wichtig ist, und das haben wir schon im europäischen Referenzrahmen, wir haben unterschiedliche Fertigkeiten, wir haben Hörverstehen, Sprechen, Lesen, Schreiben beispielsweise, und diese Fertigkeiten werden beschrieben, zunächst einmal unabhängig voneinander. Dieser Referenzrahmen sollte ermöglichen, dass wir beispielsweise ein Curriculum oder ein Testverfahren entwickeln, was nur das Hörverstehen testet oder nur das Lesen oder nur das Schreiben. Das heißt, wir haben unterschiedliche Stränge, die von einer sehr niedrigen Kompetenz oder Nullkompetenz bis C2 hochgehen, aber die wir natürlich nicht deswegen auch in Verbindung zueinander setzen, in dem Sinne, dass ich jetzt sagen muss, wie kann es sein, dass jemand im Hörverstehen auf A2-Niveau ist, im Bereich Sprechen auf A1 und im Bereich Lesen und Schreiben auf 0. Das ist ein grundsätzliches Problem. Deshalb spricht sie ja auch von unterschiedlichen Profilen. Und die digitale Kompetenz muss, denke ich, auch so verstanden werden. Das heißt, wir beschreiben sie und im Prinzip ist sie auch, könnte man dann diesen Referenzrahmen nehmen und einfach nur die digitale Kompetenz betrachten. Dann wäre der Referenzrahmen auch für Menschen ohne Migrationshintergrund verwendbar und für alle Kontexte. Das geht natürlich auch. Im Unterricht wird versucht, alle Kompetenzbereiche möglichst gleichschrittig voranzubringen. Ja, das ist ein völlig anderes Thema, weil natürlich ist das geht in Richtung Individualisierung.
Würde das ist genau das, worum es mir geht. Das ist eben, glaube ich, in der Erwachsenenbildung, wo wir schon so weit auseinandergehen, für mich insofern viel hilfreicher, die Einzelnen zu betrachten und dann auch für mich griffiger. Ne? Also wäre es, als eben die in diesen Bezug zu stellen. Also ich beziehe mich vor allem auch auf die Tafel, wo dann so gesagt wurde, ne? Also das Level hier, digitale Kompetenzlevel hier 1, 2 entspricht dann ungefähr da dem Level. Also man läuft doch sonst Gefahr, das entsprechend auch so zu sehen. Das ist ja das, was dann auch passiert in den Bildungseinrichtungen, wenn wir solche Verlevelung im Prinzip und Zuordnungen haben.
Ja, also, ich glaube nicht, dass sie das so gemeint hat, also sozusagen, dass wir jetzt alle gleichschrittig in allen Bereichen voranbringen müssen,
aber
sondern
dass es Tendenzen gibt. Und
das ist im europäischen Referenzrahmen auch nicht so gemacht. Also niemand sagt, wie man jetzt, also im Referenzrahmen steht eben nicht, wie man, ob man jetzt das eine mit dem anderen unbedingt verbinden muss. Normalerweise wird es gemacht und das ist auch da ein Fehler, wenn Sie wollen. Es funktioniert oft nicht. Und wir haben dieses Problem grundsätzlich in sehr vielen Kursen, dass sie eben Teilnehmer einstufen auf der Grundlage schriftsprachlicher Kompetenzen, obwohl sie im Bereich Mündlichkeit auf B2-Niveau sind. Und das heißt, die Gruppen passen nicht zusammen, sie sind immer heterogen und das wird mit der digitalen Kompetenz genauso sein. Das heißt, Sie werden einen Teilnehmer haben, der sehr hohe digitale Kompetenz hat, gleichzeitig nicht lesen und schreiben kann und dann auf B2-Niveau sprechen kann, beispielsweise.
Genau, und aus diesem Grund würde ich vorschlagen, das eben voneinander unabhängig eben eher zu sehen. Das war mein Einwand. Ich möchte auch übrigens nochmal, das konnte ich eben nicht sagen, Entschuldigung, ich versuche es kurz zu machen. Wenn ich jetzt Deutsch bin, bin ich dann sicher. Aber es wurden dann auch so verglichen, die Kompetenzen, die beim Lesen, Schreiben im Verhältnis zu den digitalen gesehen wurden. Da war dann irgendwie Kreativität oder Gestaltung, Design dabei und ich glaube auch irgendwie Recherchieren oder so. Da wollte ich nochmal bestreiten, dass das eben beim Schriftsprachlichen nicht der Fall ist. Also ich sah diese Kompetenztrennung so nicht.
Unser Dolmetscher hatte Feierabend, aber ich versuche mal.
Okay.
Sorry, so I'll try to translate the question, and the question is from the lady. You show us a slide which shows the difference between literacy and digital literacy.
Yes.
And can you please just go back to that slide?
I don't know how to get it on the system here. Okay.
Okay.
Let's see.
So, and her question is the difference between you show us the difference between literacy and digital literacy.
Yeah.
And under digital literacy, there's, for example, like creativity.
Yeah.
Yes, like research or whatever. It's better you show us the slide.
Yeah.
And she mentioned that it's not, in the other one. So how can you please explain it? Yes, exactly. Yeah. So why are there so many, requirements for digital literacy?
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, very interesting and very good question. That's the definition. That's what I said, that literacy in general is defined as, in the literature, by researchers, by educators, they only define it as the ability to read and write. So if we look at all the definitions of literacy, they only require or assume that you need two things: ability to read and write. But when they go and try to define digital literacy, they put all of this under digital literacy, regardless of whether you're doing this in L1 or L2. So they put all of these skills, including evaluating, for example, what is right, what is valid, what is fake, what is not, managing, sharing information, all of this. They all put these skills under digital literacy. So, yes. Yes, yes. Yeah, not at all.
Okay, eine Frage noch?
Irene Jansen-Stürmer von der Volkshochschule Ravensburg. I just like little resume of the things, or how I understand it. Digital literacy, as we talk today, I see very much as empowerment, and not that much in the idea of testing or anything. So I would say this is more like the way, at least that's the way I understand it. It's like a guidance as well for the teachers or people who deal with migrants, to empower people using digital tools, digital devices or whatever. Is this also intended by this kind of framework?
This is
more
actually
like a guidance than a testing?
The main intention of the is more or less as a tool to help educators rather than to test or as a testing tools. But we know for a fact that it will be used at one point as a testing or to guide testing design. I'm going to give an example from the UK, for example. In the UK, funding of courses below A1 is not standardized because they don't have standardized curriculum. They don't have standardized assessment for this. So colleges and adult centers, they struggle because they cannot show that, for example, learner can progress in 1 year from one level. So there are two levels that are below A1 in the UK, pre-entry 1 and pre-entry 2. They expect the government in general, the policy, because it doesn't match what happens in the classroom. They expect that within a year, the learner is going to move from level 1 to level 2. But then because there are no certain kind of criteria that are used for this assessment, it's quite kind of individualized materials and assessment. So at least in the case in the UK, for example, we know that test developers or institution managers, they will use it as guidance or as to develop more or less profiles of learners. So the whole intention of the framework is not for testing. It's more or less to help the educators, the learners, to find kind of like tick points where they can cover which areas, which competencies should the materials, the resources that are available. The other point is that most of the time, particularly like in the research, low literate learners are referred to as slower learners. But the only reason they are slower is because we are comparing them to literate learners. So we're expecting them to progress more or less, not us, I mean like people who develop tests in general, to progress at the same level as those literate adult learners. So what we need to consider is that those learners don't have the skills to deal with the text. They don't have the skills to deal with the test as well. So they have much more complex needs that are not met by the kind of tests that are used or the measurements that are used currently in some countries, not in all. So we do expect them at one point to be used, but that's not the main aim of the framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much then for giving us an insight into, I think, a very important development that will somehow, I think we should follow this closely, maybe also by becoming piloting institutions, but I think this will be a very important development with some,
we think so as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Vielen Dank, Rola.
Thank you very much.